Welcome to the Thyroid Fixer podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Amy, and we're diving deep into the world of hormones, especially for all you fierce women in perimenopause and menopause, and anyone dealing with hypothyroidism. If you're struggling with weight gain, you feel like shedding those pounds is an impossible feat. If you're dealing with plummeting energy levels, gut-wrenching fatigue, or a libido that seems to have left town, then you're in the right place. And don't even get me started on the hair loss. If these symptoms are sounding all too familiar, you've found your tribe. Welcome, because my goal is to educate, empower, and shake up your world. I want you to embrace every inch of that badass woman that you truly are. So if you're ready to dive in and fix things, let's get started. I know there are so many different collagens on the market, and you can walk into Walgreens or Sam's Club and pick up any old collagen out there and say, hey, I'm taking a collagen, just like everybody else in the world, right? But is the collagen actually doing anything? Are you getting rewarded for spending that money? Here's the thing, not all collagens are created equal. I know because I'm pretty sure I've tried them all. When my hair went to crap, when I started seeing my face age, the wrinkles coming out, looking at some cellulite on my bum, I'm like, wait a minute. Collagen is supposed to help with this. Why am I not seeing anything? And I would try one brand, then change to another one. And I would really give it a good shot. I would give it a good 2 months with each brand to see if it would make a difference in my skin, in my hair, in my joints. Nothing. So that's why I created my own. Collagen Fixer 2.0 has everything that I want in my collagen and that you should want in your collagen. Number one, it contains Verisol. Now, all of the collagens in Collagen Fixer 2.0 are bioactive, trademarked bioactive collagen peptides. They have a boatload of studies behind them. This is why you can't just mix collagen together and put it on the market and charge people. You have to know what each collagen does. So number one, Verisol. Verisol is studied, has multiple studies behind it, that it reduces the appearance of wrinkles because it literally plumps the skin. And it reduces the appearance of cellulite because it's plumping the skin. All cellulite is that your skin is so thin that those matrix pockets of fat are popping through, kind of like a honeycomb. So when you build up that collagen, it smooths that appearance. Same with your face, smooths the appearance of wrinkles. Fortigel, backed by studies to reduce joint pain, helps lubricate the joints. And then finally, Body Balance. And by the way, I have not seen a peptide out there that has all three peptides that I'm talking about right now. Body Balance increases your lean muscle mass and decreases fat mass. So these three collagen working together, oh my God, they're so powerful. It dissolves. Here's the other thing. My Collagen Protein Fixer 2.0 dissolves in water. You can throw it in your water. You can throw it in your coffee, in your tea, in your protein shake, whatever. And you're getting that collagen every single day. So if you're going to invest in yourself, you're going to use the collagen, which we all should. Collagen is great for your gut, for gut healing, so many different things. You want to actually see it make a difference. And that's what Collagen Fixer 2.0 will do. I made Hormone Fixer for you to get more of that GSD hormone. You want adequate levels of testosterone in order to have motivation, in order to burn fat, in order to build sexy, lean muscle that is not only going to make you better at burning fat every single day, it's also going to protect you. It's going to protect you as you age. It's going to protect your bones. You want sexy, lean muscle in order to have a metabolism. So get some Hormone Fixer. Start taking it and just enjoy the benefits. What we have been hearing from the community of people taking it, improved energy, improved strength. They're seeing their muscles pop out and look amazing when they're working out. They're getting that pump. They're having a libido. They actually want to have sex again. You cannot go wrong with Hormone Fixer. It increases your growth hormone. It increases your testosterone. The cis quadrangulus, and it helps your bones. The Tonkat Ali helps keep your sex hormone binding globulin low, which we want that as well. So it's not bound up to our thyroid hormones and testosterone. Try the Hormone Fixer. Trust me, it's going to change your world. Greg, thank you so much for joining me today. We are going to be talking about a topic that I have not yet discussed on the show yet. And it's a big, long word that maybe if you're listening, you've heard this word, but you're like, what does it mean and what's in it for me? So when we're talking about cellular senescence, say that 5 times fast, cellular senescence, essentially, I want you to explain it, Greg, but it's when we're looking at aging, which we all are looking at aging. If you're listening to this, you're looking at aging, and we're getting older every day, every minute, every hour. We have to think about not the here and now, but what's to come. Maybe it's to come in a week, or maybe we're looking down the pipe at 10 years from now. What does our life look like? What do our bodies look like? And right now in this moment is the time to start thinking about aging and thinking about what you can do and implement into your life to slow down the aging process, to improve it, to live like a badass when you're 50, 60, 70, 80, and be healthy and strong and feel good and look good. But we have to do things now. We can't put a Band-Aid on it when we're 70 years old and falling apart and our skin's hanging down to our ankles. We have to do things now to prevent that. And this is where this whole topic that we're going to get into today of cellular senescence and autophagy and aging and senolytics, how they can help, that's what we're diving into. So if you haven't heard of this term yet, just strap in for the ride. We're going to dive deep. So Greg, are you ready to go for this?
Yeah, absolutely.
Nice.
You teed it off well.
Okay. Well, then I'm just going to hand it over to you for the question of what is cellular senescence and why should we even care?
Yeah. So like stepping back, there's a framework for aging that you probably know of, and maybe some listeners have heard of, called the hallmarks of aging.
Yeah.
So this was proposed about 10 years ago, updated again in 2023. And what these people put together was a framework or a model saying, okay, whether we're looking at worms, flies, mice, monkeys, or humans, these things all seem to occur in common with the aging process and seem to underlie that process. And that one of those 12 is called cellular senescence, what you led into. And cellular cells, senescence, same root word as senile, it has to do with basically aging, right? So a simple way to think is like, okay, these are aged cells, right? They're old cells. So that wouldn't be too far off the mark. And one of the things to keep in mind is that, while we're aging, our cells are also aging. And many of the cells we had at age 20 will have lived their life, died off, been replaced with daughter and son cells, many times along the road. And if you Googled it, you'd see on average, like a cell in a human lives for 7 years. And that average is crazily misleading. And by that, I mean the neurons in our brain, those last a lifetime. We never get new neurons, right? What we have to keep good care of. Cells in our heart tissue, on average, will live about 4 decades. So, we don't turn those off over many times. Cells in the liver will turn over about once every 1 to 3 years. Skin cells will slough off. Some of those are sloughing off even as we're speaking right now. So cells live, born, live their lives and die, but at varying rates depending on the tissue. But at any given point in time, you can think of like, the majority of our cells are probably like the equivalent. The story I told to our head of marketing at one point was a gardening story because she's an avid gardener. And I said, okay, well, think of, like plants in your garden. You go out today, you look at a plant, all the leaves are vibrant green, super healthy plant. Think of that as the leaves are like the cells in our tissues, and that's a healthy tissue, like whether the liver or muscles, fat, all the leaves are green. Now you go out a week later and you see, oh, there's a couple of yellowing leaves on this plant. Well, that's not great, right? The plant's stressed, maybe too much sun, not enough water, nearby pests, you name it. Think of that as a senescent cell, right? One that's, because it's so stressed, it's starting to age prematurely in a sense. And then what ideally should happen on that plant is the yellowing leaf will fall off the plant and make room for new growth. And if that doesn't happen, then a good gardener will periodically come and prune it away, right, to make room for new growth. And so think of those yellowing leaves as kind of the equivalent of senescent cells, right? They're stressed cells that somewhere before they've died off have become so stressed that we enact a program, for lack of a better way to describe it, that prevents them from dividing and making new cells, or in our analogy, new leaves. And so ideally, just like on the plant, they should fall off the plant. And that process is called apoptosis, which comes from a Greek word that literally means falling off, in the sense that a leaf falls off a tree. So it makes sense, right? That's what should happen at the end of the life cycle of any of our cells. So in the liver, 1 to 3 years after they've done their job, that those cells will go through this natural falling off process and be replaced. So what happens with senescent cells is they're prematurely stressed and they resist that falling off process.
So we have these bad cells floating around, just kind of stressed out and angry. Yeah.
Yeah. And then, what happens as we age is more and more accumulates. So like each week you go out and check on that plant, there's more yellow leaves. And at some point that leaf will just struggle, right? It doesn't have enough healthy leaves to stay healthy. And meanwhile, the unhealthy ones are sucking up all the nutrients and other resources, right? Mm-hmm. So that's a way to think about senescent cells. They're these types of stress cells that occur starting even at a young age, but accumulate more and more the older we get. And then sometimes people will hear the analogy of a zombie cell as a way to describe them. And that's because of this idea, okay, they're not creating new cells, right? They're too stressed. We don't want to make copies of them. So, a healthy live cell will make offspring when it needs to, right? It'll divide. So they're not quite alive because they don't do that, but they're resisting this falling off process. So they're not going through cell death. So they're stuck in this zombie area between the two, right? They're not fully alive. They're not dead. They're resisting that, and they're not allowed to do this. And then the other reason you hear that is, especially the types of senescent cells that accumulate when we get older, secrete all kinds of compounds into the environment around them. So that's, scientists would say, the microenvironment. But just think of, like, again, going back to our plant analogy, right? If you have yellowing leaves and don't prune them off, they tend to attract pests. They tend to basically make nearby leaves also yellow, right? Okay. Rather than, a leaf on the other side of the plant. So senescent cells, with these things they spit out into the environment around them, can cause stress on otherwise healthy cells and cause them to become new senescent cells, right? So that's
just like a zombie biting other people, causing them to turn into zombies. I get it now. Okay.
Yeah. So so what happens, for a variety of reasons, it's like a snowball rolling downhill as we get older, that senescent cells don't just accumulate slowly and gradually. It's almost like they hit a tipping point and then explode upwards. So if we were to look at, tissues in a very old mouse or rat, as an example, we would see crazily high amounts of these stressed senescent cells compared to a young, also rat. And humans would be the same. It's just we don't look at humans much because you have to do tissue biopsies to look, at senescent cells. There's no indirect way to really test for them.
Well, and I was going to say, as we're aging, we can obviously see it on our face, and we can see the changes in our skin and our body, but we can't really see what's inside. So we tend to almost forget the fact that these zombie cells are walking around wreaking havoc with other cells. And then that brings us into, cancer, dementia, diseases of aging, and the like.
Yeah. So one of the things I think is a framework to think of, and I think your leadoff teed this up, and you probably didn't intend to. And we've all know of life expectancy, right? So if you Google life expectancy, maybe you'll see, like, in the US, men live on average to 77, women to 79, somewhere in that ballpark. But that's, again, like, that average skews reality because all the people that died really young are added in to that average. Mm-hmm. So a better way is like, okay, people that make it to 60, how long on average do they live, right? So that's usually life expectancy at 60 is how you'd see that. And then also important is what would be like healthy years that you would have after 60. So how many of those years are what you said at the beginning? Like, you're vital, you can go to the gym, you can do, play with your grandkids, do all the things that are important to you, right? So that's I think of as healthy life expectancy after 60. And this was a study that it was based on 2019 data, but it came out in the last year. But what they found is, on average in North America, people that made it to age 60 lived on average to about 82. right? So it's higher than the average life expectancy, right? Because it washes out all the young people that have died. But that about, so say that's 21, 22 years on average. All of us listening, we want more than that, clearly, right? I do. I know you do.
Yeah, right.
But what they found is on average, about the last 7 of those were in fairly ill health, assisted living or in other ways where people are really limited, right? And so there's a huge gap on average between even like what we might expect to live to and then the number of years that we can, actually live our life the way we want. And so there's this idea within the longevity space that's often called compression of mortality. But just think like we want to push that healthy window as close to the end as possible, right? Like we want to compress mortality into that really small window. And this gets to what you started with. Like to do that, I think we need to do more and start doing it at a younger age.
Yeah.
Otherwise, there's no shot. Once like the snowball's already gained momentum, then that's a really tough thing to do. And what, people like you, and, I would put myself in this category too, even though I'm much older than you, I started making good investments in my later years, starting by age 30.
Yeah.
Right, to the best that I could think out and start to do things like let's make good investments now. And the way I would think of it is the same as investing for our financial health. It's always good to make that investment, but I'd have been a lot smarter if I started making it at age 22 as opposed to waiting till I'm 62 now. Like it would have been silly to wait this long to start investing in that financial wellness. And I think of the investment that your listeners want to make is the same one that I want to make, right? Like what should I start doing and when should I start doing it to, make sure.
On that note, when should we start? Like what is a good age, or at what age do we start to see these senescent cells happening and turning?
Yeah, so that's a great question. The way we at Qualia think about it is categorize senescent cells as into 2 compartments, transient and lingering. During pregnancy, like embryo formation, there'll be waves of transient senescent cells that come in to shape fetal development, actually. And then they do their job and they vanish, right? They're transient. They just kind of pass through. And you would just say, okay, let's look at muscle biopsies in healthy 25-year-olds right after they ran a marathon or did some crazy intense exercise that's more than what they would normally do. We would see a bloom of senescent cells in those muscles immediately after that would act to call in the immune system and help regenerate, and repair that damage. And if we looked a week later, they'd be gone, pulled in, or we stressed cells fundamentally, right, with what we did, but they didn't linger. They didn't do this resist apoptosis zombie step. But the lingering ones that we talk about with aging, what you would see if we did that same experiment, crazy exercise for a young mouse, did that same amount in an old, you'd see what would be the equivalent of an explosion of senescent cells. And a week later, 2 weeks later, they wouldn't have vanished. They'd have lingered in the tissues, right? And so when I think of senescent cells, it's specifically lingering ones, right? The ones that have outsmarted the immune system, which should find the stragglers or are resisting this natural falling off. That's why we need a gardener. But what happens is progressively over time, more and more linger. So in a 25-year-old, if there are any lingering ones, it would be so small in amount that the likelihood that they're causing any problem is super low. Doesn't mean they wouldn't be, but I tend to think of many things as having a threshold, where as long as it's below that threshold, it's probably not contributing a lot. And then, if you get above that threshold, then it may be contributing to many things systematically, for sure, in that localized tissue. And so the way I would think about it is, instead of like a linear increase with age, think of it almost like a ramp, right? That gradual, and then just like exploding upward at some point. And that would vary tissue to tissue. So if someone's at a young age already struggling with joint issues, as an example, it's in all likelihood, they've got more senescent cells in that tissue than other people at that age that aren't faced with that struggle or that challenge. But they may have normal amounts of senescent cells in their liver or other tissues. The other tissues may be aging at a more normal rate because we all wear and tear unevenly. And some of that's genetics, some of it's, other things, diet, lifestyle, but we all have Achilles heels, so to speak. But if a system's aging at an accelerated rate, there's probably more senescent cells in that tissue, no matter the person's age, than you would want at that age. But in general, the way I would think about it is that by my age, the expectation is I would have way more than Greg at age 40. And he'd have had a little bit more than Greg at age 20. Right. And Greg at age 80 should have a lot more. So unless there's a gardener coming in and pruning them away, that's just the natural progression. And that we want to, to get back to what you started with, we want to do more and start young. We don't want to manage problems. We want to be a good gardener and make sure we're getting the yellowing leaves early. Right. So what would make sense to me is we would want to prune things maybe when we're 30, 35, late 30s, but maybe we don't need to prune as frequently. Where if someone's, 60, 65, already struggling with, say, joint issues, we may want to prune more aggressively initially to get the load below that threshold again. So when I think of, as we mentioned, like, by my age 30, some things I thought were good investments, like doing yoga and, meditating and exercise and trying to eat sensibly and get enough sleep, rather than like kick the can till I'm the age of my uncles, whose health I don't want to replicate, or my dad who died fairly young. I need to be smarter now. So I think of, managing senescent cells a bit like that. But for a younger listener on this call, then it would be more like, okay, maybe I would want to do something like I would do a quarterly fast or, twice a year detox, where if you're my age, I do Qualia Senolytic once a month for 2 days.
Okay, which isn't that big of a time investment, but we'll get into the details of how. Now, you had mentioned, you had brought in the term fasting, and that made me think of autophagy, because we always hear that term autophagy when people fast, whether it's a intermittent fast during the day or an extended 3-day, 5-day, 7-day fast. We are basically cleaning house. We're cleaning those zombie cells and we're getting them out. We're getting rid of the zombies. Now, how is that different from cellular senescence?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So this is going to oversimplify it, but it would be directionally correct. When our cells are stressed, door number one is like, okay, I got this. I'm resilient. I can become, I'm tough enough that I can weather the storm, right? So what you would see on a cellular level is, cell gets stressed, they'll make more antioxidant defenses and other things to become basically fitter and more resilient. Okay. But now, like, there was more stress than they could handle, maybe, so some damage occurred. And damage inside cells is, mitochondria network got dinged a little bit. Maybe some proteins got misfolded, because a lot of what's inside our cells is proteins that get shuttled around. Maybe some organelles, so mitochondria would be an example of an organelle, but there's other organelles as well, like, the ones that make our genes, right, in the nucleus. So maybe some of those got damaged. And so the next thing is, okay, can I repair the damage? So that would be door number 2, right? And so autophagy is door number 2. It's about recycling damaged proteins and organelles. So it happens inside cells to basically let's dismantle these things that are damaged and then recycle and reuse those parts. So autophagy is like, not a whole cell, but like inside cells.
So is there a different benefit though, like with autophagy that we get from an extended fast versus addressing the senescent cells? Or is there not a definitive difference?
Yeah. So what door number 3 would be, there's been so much stress that the damage isn't repairable. And that becomes cellular senescence, because we don't want a damaged cell that's not repairable to make daughter or son cells, right? We don't want it to copy itself and have new damaged cells, right? That would be not sensible, right? So that when it's an unrepairable cell, then it becomes senescent. So one way to think of it is autophagy is like an anti-senescence thing, right? Like you repair the cells so it doesn't have to become senescent. So things that promote autophagy, super important for healthy aging, because it means more cells now will go through door number 1 or 2 instead of door number 3.
Okay.
So,
but if they do go through door number 3, that's really where I'm just kind of trying to bring it into real life so people can understand. Yep. That's where the bad cells are replicating. They're making baby cells that are bad. And all of those bad cells stack up to equal cancer. So all these bad cells eventually form a cancer cell, or they equate to advanced aging. When you look at someone and you're like, wow, I know that they're 50, but they look like they're 65. Am I getting that right?
Directionally, but there's a couple nuances. So think of cancer as its own variety of stress cells.
Okay.
But ones that have figured out how to make copy after copy after copy, right? Like that's the characteristic of cancer, right? Is that it just makes new and more cancer cells. So it's a different type of stress cell than a senescent cell, but instead of a senescent cell not being able to make copies, cancer cells go wild making copies, right? But both ideally should have gone through that falling off process, right? One of the jobs of the immune system is always to find and remove any stress cells that are lingering. So whether it's, like a cell that got infected by a virus, or a senescent cell, or a cancer cell, or like immune system, we think of as something for the most visible jobs it does, but a huge part of the immune's job is cleaning up things and keeping us healthy, right? So, and we know as we get older, there's something called immunosenescence, where the immune system just becomes less good at doing all of its jobs, including finding and removing all types of stress cells. So anyways, the big picture is the senescent cells are a type of stress cells, but cancer would be a very different type of stress cells. Okay. And that what autophagy would do is it would prevent cells from getting so stressed that they have no choice but to go in those directions. But once a cell has been that stressed, autophagy is not really a solution, because its window of opportunity for what it does would have passed for that particular type of cell.
Okay. I'm starting to get this a little bit more.
Okay, this is me literally just speaking to you from the heart. So many of you know I've been where you are with the struggle of weight gain, unexplained. Literally, you're doing everything you can and nothing is working. And I've been in the boat of crushing fatigue, like the type of fatigue you can't explain to anyone unless they've gone through it. The hair loss, legit, when you're counting the hairs that fall out of your head. I get that because I've been there. That's why I'm doing what I'm doing right now. That's why it's my passion to help you specifically get to where you deserve to be, get to optimization land, which I always joke about being in. But it's not really a joke. It's a place. It's a place of existence in your life where you can enjoy life. You can go out with your friends. You can have a glass of wine. You're not gaining weight looking sideways at a brownie. You have energy to get through the day. You don't even think about being tired because you're not tired. You're just confident. You're confident in your own body. You're confident in your own skin. And beyond that, you're out of that frustrating cycle of doctor jumping, thinking that maybe this one will listen to me. Maybe this one will actually do what they're supposed to do. And then you're disappointed again and you're crying in your car like I was. So that is why it's literally been my mission. And I've been working on this for years and finally got here to help every single person in every single state and some of Canada. So we can now prescribe to all 50 states. And the reason why this is important is because if you have low thyroid function and you have low hormones, there is no supplement, there's no diet, there's no lifestyle change that you can do to build those hormones back up. And I flat out call BS on any program out there that promises you optimization without actually using bioidentical hormone replacement therapy, including thyroid hormone replacement. If you're not making hormones properly, you're not making hormones properly, and we have to replace that. Now, many of you are in the process of begging your doctor for bioidentical hormones that they're uneducated on. They tell you scary things that just, don't believe them. And many of you are trying to beg your doctor to give you the right thyroid medication. Well, you can stop that now too, because we can order all the labs, prescribe all the bioidentical hormones, all the thyroid medication, all the things. We can do that to all 50 states and most of Canada. Now, when you work with me, when you work with my team, you're getting personalized plans, personalized treatment plans, personalized nutrition, the whole deal, top to bottom. You get what you need to get to the finish line, to enjoy your life, to live with me in optimization land, which is where you deserve to be. You deserve that. So click the link in the show notes, book a free call. We're going to go over everything with you. You don't have to remember everything I just said. The one thing you have to remember is I've been there. I can help you. I promise you're not that tough of a case. And it doesn't matter where you live in the United States and parts of Canada, we can help you.
So I guess the big question is, what's in it for me? What's in it for us to pay attention to these senescent cells? And then if there is a reason to, which I know you're going to explain, then how do we do it? Like, how do we get rid of these cells that we don't want in our body, wreaking havoc and advancing the aging process of our skin and our joints and muscles and all the things that we see go downhill as we age?
Yeah, so most of the research, and this would be true for all kinds of areas, to understand why something's happening are done in animals. And the science of senescent cells and senolytics is relatively speaking new, right? So the first big study was around 2010, and they did gene altering to these animals to make it so that senescent cells didn't accumulate with age, these lingering ones. And what they found was these animals lived longer and were way healthier. So scientists were like, wow, super cool. These, we've always thought, because of the name, senescent cells, senescence having to do with aging cells, that they had some role, but we didn't expect that big a role. So maybe the next big landmark thing was around 2015. Scientists at Mayo and Scripps Institute of Aging identified compounds that, when taken orally, could help to manage senescent cells, like reduce the load, and found the same, like these animals were just way healthier at an older age. So that created just an explosion of interest. Now, all of a sudden, it seemed like, oh, maybe there's something actionable here that we can do. And since that time, senescent cells have been looked at, like as an example with joints. They would have done an experiment where they injected senescent cells into the joints of super, like young mice and rats to see what happens. And what they find is, really quickly, we create aged joints and all the symptoms that you expect with aged joints.
Mm-hmm.
They've looked at what would be muscle tissue, and they looked, okay, so they would use the term anabolic resistance as an example. But if listeners have heard of insulin resistance, think of it as somewhat along the same lines. Like we have these
grow. Yeah, you can't put on muscle and you're losing muscle essentially.
Yeah, we're not there. Our muscles aren't responding to the anabolic signals in a way they should. They're resisting it. Mm-hmm. And anabolic signals would be like weightlifting in a human, right? Or making sure you get adequate protein for listeners, right? We know that's a huge, like, super important for everyone in an area that many times average women neglect, right? They don't get enough protein to maintain great quality muscle. So anabolic resistance is something that occurs in older animals that doesn't occur in younger ones, just like in us. Our muscles, as we get older, would be anabolic resistant. And so scientists were like, why? Like, what's contributing to that? And one of the things they identified was it was the accumulation of these zombie cells, the senescent cells, that were causing the muscle tissue not to respond anabolically when it should to exercise or more protein. And that what they did in one of these original experiments is they gave two senolytic compounds together, which then removed some of these senescent cells from the old muscle. And lo and behold, they responded to anabolic signals again, like a younger mouse muscle tissue would do. Okay. So they've looked at many areas, liver health, skin, brain health, pretty much all the things that every listener would know. Just observing people as they get older, we see visibly, and we see, like as an example, older people become more frail. They walk slower, like their whole system starts to just wind down. And so in any area that's been looked at to date in aging animals, senescent cells play a big, big role. So we don't have to go into the details of all of those, but just think of one of the classic ideas of why do we age has to do with an idea that it's because we just accumulate more and more damage at a cellular level. That's why autophagy gets a lot of interest. And senescent cells would be clearly in that category of damaged cells, right? They're stressed, they're damaged, and we accumulate more and more of them. So even going back to that original, life expectancy after age 60, healthy life after that, right? Like we want to compress that window of time to as short as possible. So that, longevity scientists would call that compression of mortality. And senescent cells are thought to be one of the things. If we address them, we push that window back, so that we'd have healthy years up closer to the end on average. Maybe it wouldn't extend how long we live, but we would, enjoy more living our years our way.
So if we want to, I'm not even going to say age gracefully, like age like a badass, not have joint pain, keep our muscle, keep our skin pulled up and not drooping, not age quickly, keep our brain healthy and alive and alert, right? We all want that. So in order to do that, this is where the Senolytics come in. So that's a whole other term that I'll let you describe, but this is the answer. Senolytics are the answer to slow down that rapid aging process caused by the senescent cells.
Yeah, so the term senolytic originated with the Mayo Clinic and some Scripps researchers, and they basically said, okay, what should we call these compounds that look like they help us, finally get the zombie cells to kick the bucket? Mm-hmm. And they decided, okay, we'll just call, sen, right, like as part of it, and it has to do with aging. Lytic has to do with kind of lysis, breaking apart. Let's just call this category of things senolytics. Yep. And, and the original two that they put in that category were quercetin, which some listeners may know, that's a dietary supplement that's a flavonoid found in onion skins, as an example. Mm-hmm. And then a medication called dasatinib. And what they found is that quercetin was a senolytic like in endothelial cells, so cells that line our arteries and blood vessels, and in bone cells, as an example in that study, but wasn't active in fat tissue when they did that first experiment. But that other compound was active in fat tissue and not so good in these other parts of the body. And so they had the idea, well, let's just put both together. Maybe they'll work better. And they found that it did, right? That they stacked well. And that combo was more senolytic than either of these things on their own. So that's usually just thought of as the D and Q stack. And that's been the most studied combination to date of compounds for senolytic compounds. And then a couple of years later, those same researchers said, okay, well, if quercetin works, maybe some other plant compounds would work as well. And what they found in that case is something called fisetin or fisetin. I hear it both ways, was even a more powerful senolytic compound in their experiment than quercetin was. And in that case, it was actually active in fat tissue where quercetin wasn't. So all of a sudden it's like, oh, well, maybe fisetin and quercetin would be a good combo to start playing with. And then over time, they've identified several other plant-based compounds. And then there's also, a big emphasis in the pharma world to see if they can find out things that act as senolytics as well.
Oh, yeah. Well, big pharma can jump on it. Look out. But luckily it's in the supplemental world right now. So I like that. I like hearing that it's staying there for now. So how do these senolytics work and how do we incorporate them in? Because, supplement fatigue is real. And a lot of people out there, a lot of my listeners out there, my patients included, they just get overwhelmed. Like, oh, one more thing. We're talking about one more thing. But my experience with Senolytics is that you don't have to take this every single day. It's not one more pill that you're adding to your little pill box over and over again. You can take it in blocks. Like you said, well, what I do now is I take my Qualia 2 days a month.
Yeah. Yeah. So let's get to how they work. And this is going to really oversimplify things, but
that's okay. I like it.
At any point in time, like a cell has basically decided I'm not going to die or I am going to die, right? I'm either going to stay and keep doing my job or I'm going to go through apoptosis, right? Mm-hmm. And the way I would think of that, it's almost like a vote in system. And as long as it's 51, like I'm going to stay, versus 49 saying like I'm going to go through apoptosis, then the cell will stay. And so what was really a kind of a cool idea, or like I think a cool part of the thought process of the original, Mayo researchers was the characteristic of these senescent cells is they're resisting apoptosis. The vote's basically in favor of hanging around, even though this cell is worn out and stressed and not doing a good job and should have gone through this. the voting system's just mucked up somewhere along the line. So, what do we know about the voting system? How does that voting system work, right? And at the hub would be what are often thought of as pro and anti-apoptotic proteins. So that's a fancy word, but just thinking the final voters, like voting stay or go. But then what influences those voters is all kinds of things. But one of those is classically thought of as nutrient sensing. The cell listening to the world around it, what are the messages it's getting, and how are those impacting these nutrient sensing pathways? And an example of a nutrient sensing pathway I know you would know about is mTOR, right? Like that would be a nutrient sensing pathway that's specific for proteins, as an example, but there's other nutrient sensing pathways. And one of those is where things like the quercetin, the fisetin, some other flavonoids like luteolin work. They seem to shift how cells sense the environment and then the messages that the cells send to the voters at the end of the day. And so they kind of correct that whole system in a way that finally gets the cell to decide, oh, I get it. There's no reason for me to hang around anymore. I can finally go through this natural falling off process. So these plant-based ones, many of them work there, right? They're just kind of influencing the end voters in ways that allow the cell to finally go through the normal process it always should have gone through.
Okay.
And then you asked about the frequency. And so going back to that original D and Q stack, quercetin's been used. I've been a naturopathic doctor, coming up on 30 years, and quercetin was being used by naturopaths and functional medicine MDs before that, even, right? It's very safe. But the D part of it is a really potent medication that has, can have negative effects on the immune system if not used in the right way. And so the Mayo researchers at the time said, okay, well, all we need to do is change the voter's mind once. We don't need to change it every day. We just need for that particular cell to change it once. Then that cell will finally toggle into this falling off process and we're good. And so maybe instead of doing it every day, like, some of the listeners maybe are on thyroid medications or insulin or hormones or, female hormones, you name it, right? Those things generally you're doing every day, right? Because you need to be impacting that system on a continuous basis. But it was more like, oh, we just need to normalize it once, right? D's got a really good medical uses, but in this use, maybe instead of doing every day, it would be safer just to do it intermittently, right? So from the get-go, they said, okay, let's just do this hit and run approach. Just try to change the voters' minds once and then give a vacation from it. And then we'll do it again to, maybe get more senescent cells the next go round. And their thought process was basically, this looks like the best risk reward to do, right? Rather than more aggressively. So almost baked in from the beginning was this idea of intermittent use of senolytic compounds, and in large part because of the D part. But I still think that's the best way to approach even the plant-based ones, because I don't know if this would make sense to you, but one of the big, I guess, things that people don't understand is that our senses aren't designed to detect quantities of things. They're designed to check or to see or hear how quantities change.
Can you explain that more?
Yeah. So like an analogy, imagine going into the darkest closet in your home for any of the listeners and now lighting one candle. Your eyes would notice a big difference. Now imagine going into that same closet and there's 99 candles lit and you light one more. Like maybe notice no difference, right?
Right. Okay.
Right? So one candle doesn't matter. It's like the proportion of change, right? From a completely dark, one candle, huge response. From well lit, one candle, maybe nothing, right? So all senses, and it's why hearing is a log scale. Like decibel system, you've probably heard of from hearing, that's not a linear thing. It's an exponential log scale is how they would, so to go from 60 to 70 decibels is a lot less noise than to go from 70 to 80 because it's a log. And the reason they did that is because scientists have known since the 1800s that our senses respond to proportional change, not to quantities. And so my assumption is the receptors on our cells work on the same principle. Like, why wouldn't they, right? They're sensing their environment just like our eyes and ears are sensing ours, right? And so the reason that becomes important is doing Senolytics 2 days a month, you're creating a massive change. You're doing much more like walking into a dark closet and lighting a candle. where if you were doing the same thing every day, and listeners would know this, right? If you hold noise unchanging, the background noise, our brain will really quickly ignore it.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So think of like being in a restaurant that there's a lot of background noise. Really quickly, we tune out all of that. Right. And we'll be hearing the people talking to us. But now imagine, a table nearby, someone says, Greg, right? I'll hear that, right?
Yeah.
Because that will get my attention. It stood out from the noise, right? So the scientists would call that signal to noise. But by doing something continuously all the time, we're making it so that it's a big signal is less likely to stick out. But by doing something intermittently, we're more likely to notice it. So I also think that's why, the frequency, can be more variable. I mentioned earlier, if I was young, maybe I would do this, once a quarter. But that's why once a month, I'm taking a massive dose of fisetin and quercetin and some of these other things. My cells aren't going to miss that signal. Where if I was taking a lower amount every day, there at some point it's like, oh, I heard the same signal yesterday, the day before, like who cares?
Right.
And since we're trying to work on nutrient sensing pathways, I think it just makes a lot of sense to create this big change just a couple days a month, as an example.
And very easy to do as a user, as a consumer, super easy to do just a couple times a month. It just reminds me of the bioregulators, that you really only have to use those 10 days a month to elicit a change to that system, that organ, whatever you're hitting with the bioregulator. So this sounds very, very similar. I mean, not similar in the lines of bioregulators, but similar in the dosing, that you don't have to commit to a daily dose. All we have to do is take it, once a month? Is that for everybody, or who actually should use Senolytics? I mean, we talked about pretty much anyone over the age of 40, maybe some people in their 30s, but after the age of 40, we really should be using this monthly.
Yeah. So we've done a couple studies at Qualia, including one with a placebo group. And what we did for all those studies to date, is we recruited people with some degree of joint issues. We didn't care about the age, right? They could be, say, 35 to 70, as long as they were already having some issues with flexibility, discomfort, activities of daily living. And what we did for those studies, in part, initially just like, okay, how can we get the most people to complete a study? We had people take 2 days on, 12 days off, 2 days on, 12 days off, 2 days on. So over 5 weeks, they would have taken Qualia Senolytic for 6 days, with a vacation 12 days in between each. And what we saw in those two studies was about a 65% improvement in how their joints performed, right? So a big change with that intermittent thing. So that would be almost the smallest window of intermittent timing that we've experimented with. Now, I know some people on their own that are having many more issues that their doctor said, Greg, can I give them this, every weekend and just 5 days off, which I'm sure, experiment with that. Let us know what you see. For me, I'm not experiencing anything that I would notice. My joints feel great for my age. I don't have anything other than what I would think is I'm trying to just invest in making sure I keep things below the threshold. So for me, it makes more sense. I'll just do it once a month, as an example. So that's kind of our default recommendation. And what we have the most data on is people doing it once a month. For a younger person who I would expect in general to have even fewer, then it would make more sense to me to do it even a bigger gap between cycles. And that's why I said earlier, if I was 30, 35 and wanted to start, experimenting here, I would probably just, once a quarter might be sufficient. So kind of just depends where someone is on that continuum. But, for most listeners, I would say, just default to what I do and what most of our users have done, which I always do my Qualia Senolytic the first weekend of every month. It's easy. Those days, I don't do any other supplements. I just take these few things and then I'm good for the month. And then, the goal is just to gradually make sure that we prune away more and more over time, right? And, then I think that pruning analogy also makes sense, because what would happen if you pruned a plant every day?
Yeah, I wouldn't like it that much. That's true.
Yeah,
you'd get down to nothing, right? You'd prune it away to nothing.
Yeah, we'd kill it, right? So like a good gardener only prunes periodically. So that's also like another way just to think of things like Senolytics or Qualia Senolytic. Like you're just, you're doing something that's acting as the gardener or supporting pruning. And you don't need to do that all the time. In fact, you want to make sure you have gaps between each pruning session so to aggressively prune away things.
And I love this whole topic of doing things to anti-age, doing things now. And my audience knows that I'm not the type like Dave Asprey who wants to live to 150. I'll take 80 to 90, but just living really, really well and feeling great. So the fact that I can do something just once a month, a couple days a month, and invest into my future self and my aging future self, I think it's a no-brainer. And that's really, I mean, when I started looking into this world of Senolytics, Qualia was the only company that I found who dives into this research and that produces a high-quality Senolytic. I don't even know if there's another company out there, but that's why I wanted you on the show, is to dive into the science so that I could understand it better and my audience could understand it better. Because it's one thing to say like, okay, well, you're taking these things to help you anti-age, but you only have to take it a couple of times a month. So I'm happy that you're kind of getting into the explanation and it makes it really easy. Is Qualia the only company? I mean, that's the only one that I know of that really has dove into the study of Senolytics and cellular senescence.
Yeah, I've seen a few other brands play lip service to Senolytics, but I think like there's a couple, we talked about that idea of hit and run dosing, right? Like that idea, it's for some of these things, we want to do it intermittently. I've seen companies say, oh, like we've got fisetin in our stack of things to like handle cellular senescence. So you're covered. Like we've got this hallmark covered for you.
Yeah.
And it's, and take fisetin every day. Like that's not how Senolytics work mechanistically, right? It's that we want to create that massive change. To extrapolate from the animal studies where the Mayo researchers first gave fisetin, and what they've been using in human studies is 20 milligrams per kilogram of body weight, right? So, for a 150-pound person, that would be about 1,600 milligrams of fisetin, not 100 milligrams, right? Like, again, going back to our candle analogy, like that would be like lighting one candle versus 16 candles. Is that likely to make a difference? Yeah, right. And so something can be a senolytic compound, but if you don't get enough of it, it's not likely to do something. And the analogy I would just use in my brain is like, we all know saunas can be a really useful tool, right? To keep us healthier, part of our longevity profile. And, the key thing there is temperature, right? So if we go into a sauna and the temperature is set to 60, is it really a sauna?
Right.
Right. If it's 140, 160, yes. Right. So the same, like fisetin at 100, is that really, like a senolytic? No. And then the last thing goes to that original Mayo work where they decided, let's stack D and Q together. Something could be senolytic, but that didn't mean it was equally active in all tissues. In fact, they found that things were not. So we at Qualia think it's important to stack multiple potential senolytic compounds together that collectively, support a broader range of tissues. So one of the things we have is piperlongamine, which is a compound found in Ayurvedic plant called long pepper. Think of it as a relative of black pepper, but one that we don't use in our country. And that in Ayurveda would have had an affinity for organs like the lungs and the kidneys, as an example. Curcumin, many listeners might know of curcumin for joints. Olive leaf extract also has an affinity for joints. There's a proprietary blend of nodo ginseng and sweet chestnut root called Senactive, and Senactive's been studied for muscle tissues for senescent cells. So one of the things when we were creating Qualia Senolytic, we wanted to make sure we had a portfolio of ingredients that supported multiple different tissues, because something can be a senolytic like fisetin, but it doesn't mean it's going to broadly support every tissue you need it in. So we just think it's better and smarter to do this portfolio approach.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. And I'm so happy that I found Qualia and found your company to be able to use. Now, just like you, I use it for more prevention. There's not something going on with me that I want to see change. But let's say someone has joint issues or someone, and I hear this from my community and from my patients too, that anabolic resistance. My ladies are like, I'm lifting heavy, I'm doing the protein, I'm getting the sleep, and my muscles just aren't growing. So of course we look at testosterone and thyroid and hormone balance, how much protein are you taking in, all of that. But if someone is really experiencing this anabolic resistance at the muscle level, how many months of using a senolytic will it take for them to see, oh, now I'm getting a bang for my buck at the gym?
Yeah, I think it's going to vary kind of again, like, are you above the threshold, below it, how far below? But I would say in general, give it at least 3 months. Like one of the things I looked at, so my first career before naturopathic doctor was I was an officer in the Navy, I went in active duty 84 and got out in 89 and spent most of that 5 years sleep deprived, body clock disruption, not a great diet because eating Navy chow, in a pretty toxic environment. I went through 2 overhauls, which you're in a shipyard exposed to like metals and fumes and you name it, right?
Right.
So, and plus I was more a partier lifestyle, that younger version of Greg until he became a better investor.
Sure.
And, so that contributed, right? And to accommodate, kind of to try to balance things out, I exercised way more then than I did now, but I didn't allow anywhere near as much recovery time as I would have needed given all that stress. So my intuition is that I probably built up, despite thinking I was healthy, built up a lot more senescent cells than I should have because like my life was so out of balance in so many ways.
Yeah.
Right. And so, and I've never been genetically a big gainer for lifting weights. I'm more that I would have been a cross country runner built in high school. So, right. So for me, it was one of the things I paid attention to was, I track all my lifting workouts. I personally use the X3 bar for people that might be familiar with that, heavy straps. Yeah. And I felt pretty plateaued for a while and had been doing different things to work around that. But that's what I paid attention to. And I got unstuck pretty quickly when I started taking Qualia Senolytic. But it's going to, it's so individual, right? But that's something I paid attention to. Yeah. Another area I mentioned was joint comfort. One of the things that's really clear about senescent cell accumulation in fat tissue in animals is it contributes really strongly, not necessarily to the number of fat cells, but to all the metabolic bad things they do, right? Insulin resistance and blood sugar issues and things like that. So, if someone's already struggling with those, like pay attention to those kinds of things. And then, old injuries, right? Or I used to do a lot of trade shows. I worked for a company called Thorne right when I graduated naturopathic school and used to do a lot of trade shows on the circuit back in the 90s, early 2000s. And even back then, closer to maybe late 30s or so back then, I would feel it in my knees and lower back by the end of, a day or two standing on trade show floors. And I don't do very many trade shows. Qualia, we just don't do that many, right? We do Dave's biohacker event. We're going to be at Eudaimonia, so I do a few. But Dave's recent event in Dallas, I noticed that the end of the first day, the end of the second day, my back was so much better. My knees are so much better than they had been 24 years ago.
When you were younger. Yeah. Yeah.
And I don't know what else to attribute that to, right? Like that's, to me, it seems like those have always been, I know, like when I get some stress, some low level inflammation, that's where it seems to be felt. And it just wasn't felt as strongly. So, but I think we're all different, right? So we just have to pay attention. And then, like I said early on, like I didn't go into taking Qualia Senolytic expecting to notice any changes because I wouldn't have said, oh, I'm feeling a bunch of things. And, so some other things like we've noticed a fair amount of people say, oh, like my energy levels, right? It seems to be doing something in their brain. And that's an area we're looking more into. We've had that I know of. So think of this as completely N of one. Listeners may not have any relationship to Qualia Senolytic, but we've had 6 women, including the head of our customer service, that all had stopped menstruating and started menstruating again at some point after taking Qualia Senolytic. So it seemed like for those women, for that to happen, something with ovarian aging,
balance,
yeah. Right. So again, maybe unrelated, but we've now accrued enough of those people calling in and saying, hey, like this happened. Has anyone else said it happened? That it's like, okay, this is starting to seem interesting. So, so I would just say pay broadly, anything that tends to be your Achilles heel or might be related to an aging thing, but particularly a system of your body that, is the Achilles heel, or that you have suspicions may be aging at a little faster rate, because we all have those.
We do. And you guys made a killer product to be able to help this and help all of us. So that's why I wanted you on. Thank you for unpacking this, because I was admittedly confused about the Senolytics. Well, interested in, but did not have all the information, data. And rather than going and digging for it, I thought I'd just ask an expert, because that's so much easier.
Mm.
So to me, this is a no-brainer. To add in Qualia Senolytic is a no-brainer. You're doing it a couple days a month. And why not? Why not? Why not add it in? And you guys are even giving my audience a discount. So if you go, we'll put the link in the show notes and try it out for yourself. And then really, like Greg said, give it a good run. Give it a good 3 months, whether you're looking at changing joint pain or getting those muscles back that many of you are struggling with. That's what we were talking about earlier, or just even improvements in skin or your brain. I don't know how many women out there want their period back, but you never know. So I would say absolutely give it a couple of months of use. But to me, this is a no-brainer in the arsenal of anti-aging.
Yeah, I tend to think the same. Like I take a portfolio approach to my health, the same way I do to my financial wellness. And I just consider this, at least at this point, given what we know, a really promising and easy investment for me to make.
I agree. I totally agree. Well, thank you for your knowledge and explaining everything today. It's just helped tremendously. It's helped me, and I know it will help my audience as well, just to understand this whole aging process a little bit better and what we can do about it.
My pleasure. Thank you so much for having me on today.